Well, damn, it's already been a month, so here I am again because my ADHD brain can't decide whether I want to record a video today or write another story about a guy who continuously explodes. Writing is honestly something I do more than anything else, besides maybe cleaning and playing video games, and it continues to hold a weight as one of my favorite hobbies. Hell, I wouldn't even be doing this if it wasn't for that. Because of this, I'm enticed to continuously look into new and exciting ways to write a character. God knows it's easy to get stuck creating the same things over and over again when you refuse to expand. But while creating a compelling hero can be the main battle of a story, there yet lies another: how to create a villain whose virtues are believable enough to be considered the opposite side of the coin. After all, it's difficult to persuade an audience of the hero's intentions if the villain themselves is not convincing for the hero to combat against. It's a system simple enough for children to understand. A villain commits an evil deed, and the hero brings them to justice. However, as we grow up, these ideas and roles fundamentally become skewed as the world becomes less black and white, with the enlightened understanding that there are truly no absolutes for any real person. Characters like DC's Joker and Star Wars' Palpatine are people who are dimensionally static in their ideologies and meaning in the actions they take. They are selfish, self-serving, and otherwise twisted representations of real-life social groups that we fear, that of the disenfranchised and the corrupt government official. Even these characters become the focus not in the black and white premise of good versus evil, but instead of our prejudice versus the twisted conception of what they may stereotype itself as. Like both of these characters, those who fall down the pathway are oftentimes irredeemable in our eyes, the monsters which require a hero to rise up in order to stop them. Evil in the form of twisted ideologies are far from the only representation of evil in our society. Penned characters like Magneto and Doctor Doom focus on the idea of the path to hell being paved by good intentions. Some of the time they are willing to commit themselves to a noble cause in order to yield a greater good, but other times these characters are willing to commit atrocities not only because they are evil, but because there is a grander vision, whether that be the bringing about of an evolutionary change or a new world order which undermines the current status quo. Characters who represent the worst scenarios for human beings are often bearing them closer and closer to the darkness which, in the end, allows the burning passion of their ideologies to burn seemingly brighter. Magneto, willing to commit mass murder of humans, only does so due to the hate he fostered during his time in the Holocaust and living through the turbulent 20th century. Doctor Doom is a character whose entire premise is to combat the status quo of a good with the narrative that there is an alternative method, using the seeming evil in his action to oftentimes assist the Avengers, appearing as a character that is as reputable as the hero themselves when their reasoning is brought into perspective. One form of supervillain that can be touched on is the idea of the tragic evil, those who have been cursed by their abilities to the point of eventual lethality. They have given up on the humanity they once grasped to, characters like Ace and Raven representing the fostered evil inside that one cannot always avoid. These characters know that their existence has an ending, and there is no escaping the destiny which has represented itself to them. However, despite this, they still attempt to fight back, to become something else even when they are not meant to. Ace is a Batman villain from the Royal Flush Gang who has held the ability to manipulate reality itself, however was dying because of it. Her story was to make her family rich and to get them away from trouble as they did so, and she used her powers despite the fact that it was killing her, leading to eventually the hero of the story staying with her in her final moments. Raven is a teen titan who is, while not being a villain in nature, is considered evil in her purpose. Meant to be the avatar of Trigon on the material plane, she is cursed to one day be possessed by her father who will attempt to bring about the end of all things. It is her struggle against this, along with the fact that she chooses to use her powers for a higher purpose, that it showcases the tragedy of what she will eventually become. Still, though, some villains exist not only as the heavy-handed, cape-wielding superhuman, but instead as the normal, everyday interactions we have, holding ourselves to the standards of those who oftentimes can't or won't choose to understand the goals which we have attempted to hold. A great representation of this comes in the form of Chuck from Better Call Saul, acting as the older brother who casts a high shadow using the name and reputation not as a malicious means, but instead trying to protect themselves as from someone they find harmful. In this idea, Chuck can be seen using his position of power in his company as well as his reputation in the court system to keep his brother Jimmy from maintaining a level of economic venture from his company, which he worked for years in order to achieve, choosing to use Jimmy's past mistakes as a means to degrade him and treat the man as though he was incapable of change. Due to this, it slowly forces Jimmy down the rabbit hole of evil, which could arguably be completely avoided if it weren't for the petty nature of their relationship, escalating so heavily that eventually even Chuck would become the victim of these actions. Characters like this represent the very real and very human side of conflicts that we have the day-to-day basis. Sometimes it isn't some gilded force or latent evil, but those that we know in our personal lives which commit the most hardship to our characters. Finally, we come to the anti-villain, similar to that of the previously mentioned grandiose archetype, except that these are those who have an inherent tragedy in their premise by attempting to do good. Characters like the Punisher and Lex Luthor fit this bill, as despite trying to do good in the day-to-day lives, believing in a higher purpose or attempting to use their sprees as a means of bettering the world as a whole, they are constantly brought down by their own inherent nature. Characters like these are the hardest to see because they are often the most relatable, being the man who had the opportunity for positive change but squandered it often through their own skewed interests. Frank Castle, the Punisher, is widely seen as a superhero despite the fact that he utilizes crime and violence to end organized crime rings and groups which would otherwise harm the day-to-day lives of innocents, meanwhile being vilified for his tactics as nothing more than a depraved killer because of his often endless rage. Lex Luthor, on the other hand, wishes to make sure humanity is protected from his perceived threat to the powerful aliens like that of Superman. Through this fear, he both attempts to better humanity by constantly improving its technological scope, as well as becoming one of the world's most hated villains simply because he chooses to outfit his technology to those determined to destroy people like Superman, who more than often than not become criminals in some capacity themselves. The motivations of a character can range from the simple to the utterly complex, as like a hero, they often believe that their stance on the matter is the correct ones, and that they themselves are the hero in the situation, even if the audience perceives otherwise. With this logic, characters who are evil often hold the same moral sense of virtue as the heroes themselves, often seeing as though to the disavowed that they might be the shining light in the narrative. A good example of this is the character of Batman, someone who, despite being a superhero, is widely considered by the local authorities as well as his own teammates as borderline malicious in nature, being the man who creates contingencies and plans not too dissimilar from his adversaries in order to defeat them, only yielding to the morality that he will not kill or differentiate himself from those he would fight like. Like Frank Castle, Magneto, and Doctor Doom, this trait is constantly self-evident. Between the man using crime to fight crime, the man trying to protect his species from dying out by killing out another, or the man who sees the world itself as a burden on his shoulders. They all hold a dying light between the evil they walk through, but they all are at the end of the day a comic book character, so why focus on them? For me, comic books have been a major influence. Their characters and pages, their worlds and ideas have helped shape a large swath of people in today's culture, including mine. They are, like the mythologies of old, the means for men to dream up gods and monsters with the innocent hope that no matter what, they will prevail. And that's why it's so interesting to see how in recent years the villain has evolved from simply the monster or demon of the old stories to an equally weighted perspective. We feel it for their setbacks, understand their downfalls, and sometimes we even root for their goals, and in this they become widely more memorable. This, along with the ability for the characters to be extreme versions of ideologies as a whole, allow for an easy dynamic for people to follow along with, unironically making their most inhuman features such as extreme lengths of dedication or intelligence to become the most humanizing aspect of themselves, embodying the figure of an idea we ourselves hope to achieve. Understanding their side of the story allows us to better understand others' stories. So if that makes a good villain character, what makes a bad one? Well, that's hard to tell because as subjective as the idea of a good character is, it's abstractly hard to merit a bad character. This being said, I think what constitutes a bad character most is the lack of resonance with their goal. If they do something just because they can, that's all well and good. However, if you can't be relatable in why you're doing something, you just fit the role of a jackass who's on a power trip. This isn't entirely useless, but it's probably the worst aspect of a bad character. Powers can make make little to no sense. Just look at someone like Solomon Grundy. He exists due to unnatural forces, however, can often be left with little in the way of proper motivation beyond being a hulking zombie-like creature for a story. Another character trait that often leads a villain with less than favorable memorability is when their backstory either doesn't make sense or just isn't touched on at all. The prime example of this being Kang the Conqueror, whose background is vehemently complicated for no reason other than time travel. Basically, if it doesn't make sense, no one's going to buy into it. And unfortunately, that's the hole that many creators fall into. The motivations of the hero are so substantial that the motivations of the villain become irrelevant to the story, creating an atmosphere of an egotistical character, someone whose story is all about themselves and not about the world they exist in. So what's the takeaway? Well, for me, there's just a need to voice the opinion on the fact that I'm sick of seeing characters in modern media who seems to be fighting paper itself as far as an adversary. I'm not going to throw shade on people's work, and despite what I said about any of the characters which I've talked about, excluding you, Kang, screw you, douchebag, I'm just looking to offer some constructive output for the genre as a whole. Anyways, villains are as much a complex character as the heroes themselves, having motivations which are both ethically questionable as well as morally arguable, or at least they should be. Well, you folks have a good one, and see you next upload. Hope you like the Skul the Hero Slayer playthrough. I'm trying to branch out for new methods of video editing, because honestly, it's getting old just watching the same old glorified Google slideshows that take me 3 hours to edit. Okay folks, take care and keep being spooky. Love you all.